Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a good week. Welcome to, well, I guess a belated welcome to week 4. Somehow we're in week 4 already, which means we're almost 1/3 of the way through the semester. Pretty crazy, which means this travel experience is going to creep up on us. So I hope you're enjoying the content so far. I apologize I did not post a video last week. I like to do one every week. It was just one of those weeks. So I'm going to actually do a two-part series here. The first part I'm going to review week 3, and then in the next one I'll go over week 4. So our theme this week is sustainable growth. I'll let that phrase sort of marinate around, rattle around your brain a little bit while we talk about last week. So last week was another one of those really important lessons, a lot of fundamental, foundational concepts. Um, it was like, economics 101, nothing too heavy, I don't think anyway. So we looked at neoliberal economics and sort of the basic philosophies. Really, it's just about free markets, getting the government out of the way, letting markets manage everything. That's really what it's all about. Adam Smith is seen as the father of neoliberal economics, that Wealth of Nations book, which is something you should be at least familiar with, at least know that it's out there. I mean, it's like this, 1,200 page book. It's really crazy and heavy, but um, he is seen as the first one that really started this idea of free market economics. Um, but as I think I posted in the lesson, that in the very same book where he proposes this free market idea, he also provides some of his thoughts on how it could be really bad for society. So he was actually pretty skeptical of full free markets for everything. He was a proponent of free markets, but in a more limited way than people think. And so we also talked about, and this is one of the absolutely key concepts in sustainability because we need to figure this out, this externality issue. We're going to need to figure this out if we're ever going to have a sustainable society. And if you recall, an externality is an impact of a transaction that occurs to someone outside of that transaction. So, you know, whatever I buy something and I gain, and the store gains. I lose money, they lose the product, right? So this is all the agreement that we make in this little economic transaction. But if there's other impacts outside of myself and whoever I bought the thing from, that's an externality. And these are really, really big. There's some really big ones, I guess you could say. Pollution is a really common and pretty easy to understand example of an externality. If I buy, I don't know, I put the gas in my car, I drive it to work, um, and I benefit, store benefits, et cetera. And then, but that when I burn the gas, there's gases that come out of the tailpipe that are toxic. Let's say someone, I drive through the city and someone breathes in some of that toxic air. It contributes to, respiratory issue or, God forbid, a heart attack, something like that. Um, the I don't pay excuse me, the price that I pay for gas does not include the cost of that person going to the hospital. And so the problem with externalities is they're not reflected in the market. So free markets are absolutely magical things. They're really good at managing resources, but they're only as good as the signals that are sent within them. So in other words, if something doesn't send a market signal, right? Someone gets sick, the environment is damaged some way. Climate change is impacting current or future generations. All these are negative impacts. If they're not priced into the market, then they're invisible to the market. And the problem is then you're going to cause all of these negative externalities because I'm not paying for them. So if it's not properly reflected in the market, then it just doesn't work. So that's what's called a market failure. So when all of the costs and benefits of a transaction, the true costs and benefits, if they're not included in the price, that's a market failure. So that's another key term, market failure. Um, and we went over a few, sorry to backtrack for a second, but that is such a fundamental sustainability problem. Um, and I don't have to look any further than climate change. I mean, climate change is basically one giant externality if you think about it. We're able to emit CO2 without paying for it. In most instances, there are some carbon markets and there are some carbon taxes out there. But basically, I can emit all the CO2 I want. I don't have to pay for it, but that's contributing to climate change. And so that's actually one of the goals of a lot of policy work for people that are concerned with this issue is they try to price carbon. The federal government does use something called the social cost of carbon, the social cost of carbon, which they priced into legislation. I could talk further about that if you want, but the point is that we need to, in order to have a truly functioning market or a market that functions properly, we need to price in all of the impacts of all of these transactions, and they're not. Um, and then we looked at a few folks, Julian Simon, he was a really interesting guy, but his concept that the more we use of a resource, the more we have. And remember, that has to do with the profit motive. So if something becomes, so we use a lot of something, it becomes scarce, price goes up because it's scarce. And then people find a way either number one, to produce more of it, or number two, to produce something that's a viable substitute. And then at the end of the day, to his, but through his explanation, uh, at the end of this process, we basically have more of that service, whatever we're looking for. So you could look to energy maybe as an example, and oil, we're not exactly running out, but we're also have tapped out the easy to get resources. But we're slowly replacing that with other things like biofuel and electricity, with EVs and so forth. Um, so he does have a point, but there are limitations to this process as well, because some things you just can't replace. Like, what do you do? How do you fix fresh water? How do you replace biodiversity? How do you undo climate damage? I mean, right now we probably doesn't look like we can. So anyway, the process works for a lot of sort of non-essential goods. Um, but there are some things where there's limitations. And then we went over Milton Friedman, who was seen as sort of the modern like father of free market economics. He was out there all over the place in, I don't know, the 50s, 60s, 70s. Interesting guy, nice enough guy. I think he actually really wanted to solve the world's problems, but I think, you got a pretty good sense of his belief in, how he views the government. He thought it just got in the way and made markets work improperly. Then we looked at this really, really seminal, incredibly famous article, "The Tragedy of the Commons" from Garrett Hardin. Um, so this is like famous in development and economics and sustainability circles. And if you remember, the premise here is that if you have an open access resource, it's going to end up being destroyed. So he used the analogy of a field, and people were, using the grass for their cows, but any open access resource is going to get overused, and it's because of, not because anybody wants to overuse it, because it's kind of human nature in a way. Because the really important takeaway from that was that if nobody's managing a resource, and then to use that resource, you gain all of the benefit. But because everybody, like, nobody owns it, so we kind of all own it in a way. Um, I get all the benefit, but I spread out the negative across everybody, right? So everybody shares in the downsides of how I use that resource, because we're all losing a little bit of access to that resource. And so when that happens, if I'm actually motivated to use as much as I can because I get all the benefit, but I share the downsides with everybody else. So you sort of weigh those two things. It's like, well, you know, why wouldn't I use more? There's sort of this instinct to use more. And so that's seen as a problem, I think, for obvious reasons. And I think, again, one of the big examples of this is the atmosphere, right? So the atmosphere, by some, it can be referred to as the atmospheric commons, because nobody owns the atmosphere, airspace and all that, but nobody owns the atmosphere. And so to emit pollution into the atmosphere, if I'm emitting pollution, I get all the benefit, but I don't, I'm not being negatively impacted right away. It's being spread out among everybody across the world and future generations. And so what happens is we pollute too much. And there's this motivation to pollute because we get all the benefit, but we don't, get have to deal with all the downsides. But it can be applied to any open access resource. Then we've talked about market failure. We've talked about tragedy of the commons as a pollution is a tragedy of the commons issue. Private cost and social cost, that's just I think it's digging a little deeply into the economic side of things, but it's private cost is just the cost to an individual or a company, whoever. And then social cost is the cost to society. And so an externality is when the social cost is greater than the private cost, right? So the cost of society is greater than the cost to me. That means by definition, there's a negative externality. We looked at e-waste, which is electronic waste, which is still an issue. There are some solutions to this, and if this is something you're interested in, people are trying to address this issue both domestically and internationally. But that's an externality because um, remember that's where people are taking the electronics apart by hand to pick through and find the precious metals and so forth. And meanwhile, there's a lot of toxins in there. I mean, really toxic stuff. And that's not included in the price of the electronics. So there's some solutions to that as well. Some companies, I think the EU and has some kind of policy where the companies are forced to take the electronics back. So if we can just price in returning the electronics to the seller, then there's different ways to do that. But if you can incentivize people to take the computer back to the seller and then they responsibly dismantle it, which is possible, that kind of helps solve that problem. And then finally, we looked at some of the solutions to the tragedy of the commons. Um, so there's sort of these basic different types of approaches. There's a free market where it's just like let the market decide. There's non-market regulation, which is basically you pass a law to ban it. Market-based regulation. This is something that's fairly popular because it's kind of like an in-between solution. And a market-based regulation is a government like creates a market for something. So carbon trading markets are out there. The most successful, example of this really ever there was a sulfur dioxide market-based regulation in the late 80s, early 90s to help address the acid rain problem. And you can look this up, but they created a market. The government created a market for this in the United States, and it basically it worked. it, they solved the acid rain problem. Power plants ended up emitting much less sulfur dioxide. And I could talk more about that if you have questions. And then there's commons property regime, which is the most sustainable solution generally, because what that means, if you recall, is that everybody manages the resource together. Everyone has equal say. And so if they all have equal say, then you can avoid the when people are taking too much, right? Because if someone's taking too much and everybody else sees that, they have the rights to tell them to stop. And this is a more democratic one. It's a more sort of long-term sustainable one. If you can, it's difficult to pull off, but you can do it. And if you want an example, you can look at the Maine lobster industry, which has managed this through commons property regime for a really long time successfully. Okay, so that's the summary of last week. Sorry for the relatively long explanation, but these are themes that we'll hit throughout the rest of the semester because they really apply to everything that we're going to learn. Some of the other stuff later on, it's sort of they're all really important, but like what issue are you going to focus on? Are you going to focus on water, biodiversity, etc.? These concepts apply to pretty much everything that we're going to study. Also, importantly, when we travel to Colorado, even if people aren't sort of consciously addressing externalities. That's really what they're doing. They have companies and nonprofits and so forth that are somehow addressing a market failure. Um, Not all of them, but a lot of them are. So this is something that, again, it applies to pretty much everything we're going to read and look at the rest of the semester, but also um, it'll pop up when we travel too. So it's certainly something to keep in mind. In particular, this notion of externalities and market failure, and this belief, like, how do we solve these problems? These big solutions? Do we have market-based regulations? Can we create a commons property regime? Is it a free market if you, etc.? So I hope you found the content interesting. And that's going to be it for this video. And I'm going to preview week 4 next.